Hello, my fellow adventurers, space explorers, and dungeon delvers. Welcome to the Game Codex, the show where we crack open the case files on the games and studios that shaped our world. I'm your host, Alora, and my mission is to make the vast, sometimes intimidating universe of video games feel like a story we're all reading together. No jargon, no pretentious deep-cut references, just the fascinating tales behind the pixels. Today, we're beginning with a story that is, for many of us, deeply personal. It's a tale of a studio that felt less like a corporation and more like a group of master storytellers who just got it. They understood the thrill of rolling a natural 20, the weight of a moral choice that keeps you up at night, and the magic of falling in love with a character made of code and polygons. For a generation of gamers, BioWare wasn't just a developer, it was a seal of quality. Seeing that logo at the start of a game was a promise of a world you could get lost in for months, of characters who would feel like lifelong friends, of stories that would stick with you for years. But this isn't just a story about those glorious highs. This is a Shakespearean drama, a rise and fall of epic proportions. It's a story about how the very magic that built this legendary studio eventually began to fray at the edges, leading to some of the most spectacular stumbles in modern gaming history. We are going to trace their entire journey. We'll stand in awe at their revolutionary beginnings, ride the emotional roller coaster of their greatest triumphs, and wince through their very public struggles. We'll ask the tough questions. What happened? How does a studio go from creating universes we dream about to releasing games that become cautionary tales? So, grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, because this is a long one. We're about to dive into the making of legends, the crushing weight of expectations, and the uncertain future of one of gaming's most beloved names. This is the BioWare story, and to truly understand the fall, we have to start at the moment the foundation finally gave way. Let's set the scene. It's February 22nd, 2019. After nearly 7 years of development, plagued by rumors, reboots, and a whole lot of behind-the-scenes drama we'll get into later, BioWare is finally releasing its next big thing. This isn't just another RPG. This is their bold leap into the games-as-a-service world, a direct challenge to titles like Destiny. The game is Anthem. The hype was astronomical. The trailers showed us freelance pilots strapping into incredible, customizable Iron Man-like exosuits called javelins. We saw a beautiful, dangerous world teeming with alien life, and the promise of flying through lush, waterfall-filled canyons with our friends. This was BioWare doing high-flying, explosive sci-fi again. What could possibly go wrong? Well, almost everything. You see, launch day for a game like this isn't like the old days. It's not about rushing to the store, tearing off the plastic, and popping in a finished disc. For Anthem, launch day was the moment the digital gates opened and thousands of players logged in simultaneously. And the servers? Well, the servers had a different plan. Many players were immediately greeted not with a world of adventure, but with endless loading screens, cryptic error messages, and the infamous Alpha 01 pilot error that locked them out completely. It was a digital traffic jam of epic proportions. But let's say you were one of the lucky ones. You got past the login screen, you finally loaded into the social hub of Fort Tarsis, you then embark on your first mission, full of hope. And then the game would crash. Or even worse, you'd experience what became known as the infinite loading screen, a torturous purgatory where your pilot would just sit in a chair, forever waiting for an adventure that would never begin. And the problems weren't just technical. The world, so beautiful from a distance, felt empty and repetitive. The missions were criticized for being boring and monotonous. Go here, defend this point, collect these fragments. The loot, the very heart of any looter shooter, felt unsatisfying and unrewarding.
The story, BioWare's supposed crown jewel, was confusing, buried in menus, and utterly forgettable. The most infamous moment, the one that truly became the symbol of Anthem's failure, was the health bar bug. In a game all about becoming more powerful, players discovered that the damage numbers on your gun were a lie. The game was secretly calculating your damage based on the base level stats of any gear you had equipped, even if it was low level. So that awesome, shiny, high-level sniper rifle you just spent hours grinding for, it might actually be doing less damage than the common level one you started the game with. It was a fundamental, mind-boggling flaw that broke the entire core loop of the game. Within days, the internet was a symphony of outrage. Review scores plummeted. Memes of crashing javelins and endless loading screens flooded social media. This wasn't just a bad launch. For a studio of BioWare's pedigree, it was a humiliating catastrophe. It was the moment the veil was ripped away. The BioWare Magic had finally, and very publicly, run out. This disastrous launch wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a decade of growing problems. To understand how BioWare got here, how they fell from crafting masterpieces to producing a game that was, in the words of one critic, a tragedy of anthemic proportions, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back to the very beginning, to a time when two medical doctors decided to make a game in their basement.
Before we were commanders or inquisitors, before we were Revan, we were a random child of Baal. To understand BioWare's peak, we have to go back to 1998, to a basement in Edmonton, Alberta. The company was founded by three doctors, Ray Muzica, Greg Zeshuk, and Augustine Yip. Yes, you heard that right, doctors. They literally decided making games was more fun than, performing surgery. And thank the gaming gods they did. Their first major project was a collaboration with a company called Black Isle Studios, and it was called Baldur's Gate. Now, to set the stage, the computer RPG scene in the late 90s was niche. It was dominated by hardcore, often impenetrable games with clunky interfaces. Then Baldur's Gate arrived, and it was a revelation. What did it do that was so special? First, it took the incredibly complex tabletop-tested rule set of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically the 2nd edition rules, and made it not just accessible, but thrilling. You controlled a party of 6 characters in real time, but you could pause the action at any moment to issue precise tactical commands. This was the birth of the real-time with pause combat system that would become a BioWare signature. It was the perfect blend of chaotic action and thoughtful strategy. Second, it gave us a world that felt truly alive and massive. The Sword Coast wasn't just a backdrop, it was a place you lived in. You could spend hours just exploring the wilderness maps, stumbling upon hidden dungeons, quirky side quests, and random ambushes by wolf packs that would make you jump out of your chair. The scope was unprecedented. But the real secret sauce, the ingredient that BioWare would perfect over the years, was character and story. Baldur's Gate was filled with memorable voice-acted party members like Minsk, the lovable ranger with a hamster named Boo, who would famously yell, "Go for the eyes, Boo! Go for the eyes!" These characters weren't just automatons. They had personalities. They bickered with each other. They approved or disapproved of your actions. They made you care. Baldur's Gate was a monumental critical and commercial success. It didn't just sell well, it single-handedly revived the computer RPG genre. It proved that there was a massive audience for deep, story-rich, party-based adventures. It established BioWare not just as a good developer, but as the undisputed master of the Western RPG. They were the golden children, the wizards from the north, and they were just getting warmed up.
Flush with success, BioWare did what any brilliant, ambitious studio would do. They looked at the biggest sci-fi franchise in the world and said, "We can do that." And they did. In 2003, they released Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, or KOTOR, and in doing so, they didn't just make a Star Wars game, they created what many still consider the greatest Star Wars story ever told, in any medium. Let that sink in. They arguably outdid the movies. How? By understanding the core of Star Wars better than anyone at the time. They took the familiar tropes, Jedi, Sith, droids, the Force, and pushed them 4,000 years into the past, giving themselves the creative freedom to tell a brand new, epic story unburdened by the Skywalker saga. The gameplay was a refined sci-fi version of the Baldur's Gate formula, now using a G20 rule set, but the real revolution was in the narrative. KOTOR introduced the world to the BioWare dialogue wheel, a system that made conversations fluid, cinematic, and central to the gameplay. And it gave us one of the most stunning, mind-blowing plot twists in video game history. I won't spoil it for the 3 people who haven't played it, but suffice it to say, it was the "no, I am your father" moment for a new generation. This twist worked because of the game's masterful handling of the light side, dark side morality system. Your choices genuinely mattered, shaping your character's appearance, your powers, and how the world reacted to you. You could be a paragon of virtue, a sneaky scoundrel, or a full-blown, force-choking monster. This wasn't just about being good or evil, it was about role-playing. It was about defining who you were in this galaxy. KOTOR was a cultural phenomenon. It was a system seller for the original Xbox and won dozens of Game of the Year awards. It proved that BioWare's success wasn't a fluke. They could take someone else's universe, someone else's lore, and not just do it justice, but elevate it to new heights. They were now narrative royalty.
With the keys to both Dungeons & Dragons and Star Wars in their pocket, BioWare did the only thing left to do. They built their own universe from scratch. In 2007, they launched Mass Effect, and with it, one of the most beloved sci-fi series of all time. The ambition was staggering. This wasn't just a game. It was the first chapter of a planned trilogy. You played as Commander Shepard, and from the very first character creation screen, this was your Shepard. The dialogue wheel from KOTOR returned, but now it was sharper, with Paragon and Renegade interrupts allowing for spontaneous action hero moments that defined your personality beyond just nice or mean. The universe BioWare built was breathtaking in its detail. The Codex entries weren't boring filler. They were legitimately fascinating sci-fi world building, explaining everything from alien politics to the physics of Mass Effect relays. You could spend hours just reading and feel like you'd taken a university course on galactic history. But the true, undeniable heart of Mass Effect was your crew. This is where BioWare's character writing reached its zenith. Garrus Vakarian wasn't just a Turian with a sniper rifle. He was your best friend, your brother in arms. Tali Zora wasn't just a Quarian on her pilgrimage. She was the little sister you protected. Liara T'Soni, Urdnot Rex, these characters felt real. Their loyalty missions weren't side quests. They were essential chapters in your shared story. And the relationships you formed, especially the romances, became iconic, creating emotional bonds with pixels and voice acting that were stronger than most real-life relationships. Don't at me. The trilogy built upon this foundation with Mass Effect 2, a masterpiece that perfected the formula with a suicide mission that had genuine, gut-wrenching stakes, and culminated in Mass Effect 3, which delivered an emotionally devastating, if controversially ending, climax to the saga. For years, BioWare wasn't just making games. They were creating shared emotional experiences for millions. They were untouchable.
But wait, you might be thinking, Alora, what about fantasy? Fear not. While Shepard was saving the galaxy, BioWare was also building a new dark fantasy world to call their own. In 2009, they released Dragon Age Origins.
Origins was a conscious return to their hardcore roots. It was a love letter to Baldur's Gate, dripping with dark fantasy tropes, blood mages, and darkspawn. It was brutal, difficult, and unapologetically complex. The origin stories themselves were a genius touch. The first few hours of the game were completely different, depending on whether you were a Dalish elf, a castless dwarf, or a noble human, making your character's connection to the world feel immediate and personal. It was a massive success, but the gaming landscape was shifting. Consoles were becoming the dominant platform, and audiences were gravitating towards faster, more action-oriented experiences. BioWare, always adapting, began to pivot. Dragon Age 2, released in 2011, was the first major sign of this internal conflict. Developed in a shockingly short time, less than 2 years, it was a more action-focused, personal story. While praised for its fantastic character writing, particularly in Varric and Isabella, it was heavily criticized for its repetitive environments and simplified RPG systems. It felt rushed, a product of corporate deadlines rather than creative passion. Then came Dragon Age Inquisition in 2014. This was BioWare's attempt to have its cake and eat it too. It combined the strategic, top-down tactical camera from Origins with the action-oriented combat of DA2. It presented a massive, sprawling open world filled with, well, a lot of stuff to collect. Inquisition was a critical darling, winning numerous Game of the Year awards. It was polished, beautiful, and epic in scale. But for many longtime fans, it also felt a bit safe, a bit bloated. The handcrafted narrative brilliance was sometimes diluted by vast, empty hinterlands filled with generic fetch quests. It was a masterpiece of compromise, but it also signaled that the studio's identity was beginning to split. Were they the hardcore RPG masters, or were they blockbuster action-adventure creators? This identity crisis was about to have serious consequences.
The immense success of the Mass Effect Trilogy created an impossible problem. What do you do next? The answer, after much deliberation, was to leave the Milky Way and Shepard's story behind. The new game, Mass Effect Andromeda, would be a fresh start, launching a new arc in a whole new galaxy. It sounded great on paper. In practice, it was a perfect storm of development hell. Andromeda was developed primarily by BioWare Montreal, a newer, smaller studio, while the main teams in Edmonton and Austin were focused on their new top-secret project, Anthem. This immediately created a talent drain. From the very beginning, Andromeda was the B-team project. Reports from developers later described a project with no clear vision, plagued by indecision and technological hurdles. They spent years trying to get a procedurally generated universe to work, similar to No Man's Sky, but it never came together. Late in the development cycle, they were forced to scrap this ambitious but broken concept and start over, building a more traditional, narrative-driven game, with only about 18 months of real development time. This frantic, last-minute crunch resulted in a game that was, to put it mildly, a mess at launch. While the combat was fun and the jetpacks added a new verticality, everything else felt rushed and unfinished. The story was forgettable, the new characters failed to capture the magic of the original crew, and the new alien species were bland. But what Andromeda is most remembered for are its technical failures. The animation. Oh, the animation. Characters' faces were uncanny. Eyes stared in different directions, lips didn't sync with dialogue, and expressions ranged from bizarre to utterly horrifying. The internet had a field day creating memes of characters' glitchy, contorted faces that spread like wildfire. It was a public relations nightmare. For a studio built on character and story, this was an unforgivable sin in the eyes of many fans. Andromeda wasn't a total failure, but it was the first major crack in the BioWare statue that everyone could see. It was a warning shot, a sign that the BioWare Magic was failing, and the worst was yet to come.
Which brings us back to where we started, Anthem. We already saw the disastrous launch day, but how did a project with a 7-year development cycle, led by BioWare's A-team, end up in such a state? The answer is a tragic story of a project lost at sea without a captain. By all accounts, Anthem's pre-production period was agonizingly long. For years, the team had no clear direction. They knew they were making a multiplayer-focused game, but they didn't know what it was about. The now famous 2019 Bloomberg report by Jason Schreier revealed a studio in chaos. Developers described the infamous BioWare Magic, the belief that no matter how behind schedule or mismanaged they were, they would somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat at the last minute and create a masterpiece. For Anthem, the rabbit never showed up. The game's core design wasn't locked in until a disastrous E3 demo in 2017 forced their hand. The demo, which showed a fully formed vision of the game, was mostly a fake, a vertical slice built specifically for the show. The problem? The actual game didn't exist yet. The executives had just promised the world a game that they hadn't even started building properly. The team was then forced to spend the next 18 months in crunch mode, working nights and weekends in a desperate, soul-crushing attempt to build the game they had just faked. This is why Anthem launched with so little content, a broken loot system, and a hollow world. It wasn't a lack of talent or effort from the developers. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership and vision. The BioWare Magic wasn't magic at all. It was the result of talented people being pushed to their absolute limits. And this time, the limits were too far. Anthem didn't just fail commercially and critically. It broke the spirit of the studio and shattered the trust of its fans. It was the fall.
So, what was this BioWare Magic really? For years, it was a point of pride, a whispered legend about the studio's ability to pull off miracles. But as the stories from Andromeda and Anthem surfaced, a darker truth emerged. The magic was actually a euphemism for a deeply ingrained, toxic culture of crunch. Crunch is the industry term for the mandatory, often unpaid overtime that developers are forced to work in the months leading up to a game's launch. It means 80-hour weeks, missed family events, burnout, and broken health. At BioWare, this wasn't an occasional emergency measure. It was baked into the production schedule. The management, many of whom were veterans of the good old days, operated on the assumption that the team would always crunch at the end to make the game great. This created a cycle of poor planning. Why plan efficiently when you know your team will just work themselves to the bone to fix it later? This model worked in the early 2000s when games were smaller and teams were younger, but it was completely unsustainable for the blockbuster-scale games BioWare was now making. The human cost was immense. Developers reported suffering from anxiety, depression, and marital problems. Talented, passionate people left the industry altogether, their love for game development extinguished by exhaustion. The magic was, in reality, the burnout of their most valuable asset, their people. The legendary studio, built on the passion of its employees, was slowly consuming itself from the inside out. The glorious stories we loved were, for some, born from a period of profound personal struggle. In the smoldering crater left by Anthem, what was left of BioWare turned to its one remaining, trusted franchise, Dragon Age. The next game, now titled Dragon Age Dreadwolf, is being positioned as the phoenix that must rise from the ashes. But the question on everyone's mind is, can it? The development of Dreadwolf has reportedly been just as rocky as its predecessors. It was initially conceived as a live service game, a multiplayer-focused title in the vein of Anthem, following the industry trend.
But after the failure of Anthem and the success of single-player games like God of War and Elden Ring, BioWare made a crucial and very public pivot. They announced that Dreadwolf would be a single-player, story-driven experience first and foremost. It felt like a course correction, an apology to the fans. But the pressure is unimaginable. This isn't just another Dragon Age game. This is the game that must single-handedly restore faith in the BioWare name. It must prove that the studio has learned from its mistakes, that it has reformed its toxic culture, and that it still remembers how to craft the kind of character-driven narratives that made it famous. The legacy of the company is quite literally on the line. If Dreadwolf succeeds, it could mark a triumphant return to form. If it fails, if it's another Andromeda, or heaven forbid, another Anthem, it's hard to imagine how BioWare could survive as a major studio. The stakes have never been higher. So, what does the epic saga of BioWare ultimately teach us? It's a story that holds a mirror up to the entire video game industry. First, it's a cautionary tale about the perils of scale and corporate assimilation. The BioWare that made Baldur's Gate was a passionate, independent studio. The BioWare that made Anthem was a subsidiary of a massive corporation, Electronic Arts, beholden to shareholders and market trends. The push for live service models and endless growth often clashes with the slow, careful, and personal craft of making a great RPG. Second, it exposes the myth of crunch. The BioWare Magic was an unsustainable, human-costly practice that the industry is only now beginning to reckon with. A studio's greatest resource is its people, and when you burn them out, you burn your future. But lastly, and perhaps most importantly, BioWare's story teaches us about the incredible power of video games to connect with us on a human level. The reason their fall hurt so much is because their highs were so sublime. They gave us moments of pure joy, heartbreak, and camaraderie that we will carry with us forever. They showed us that games could be more than just entertainment. They could be art. The legacy of BioWare isn't just Anthem's failure. It's Minsk and Boo. It's the twist on the Leviathan. It's the suicide mission. It's romancing Garrus. It's the Lance meet. It's a generation of gamers who learned that their choices could matter, that they could be the hero of a story that felt truly their own. For that, we will always be grateful.
And that, my friends, is the Codex entry on BioWare. It's a story with no definitive ending yet. The next chapter is still being written, waiting in the shadows for Dreadwolf to arrive. It's a reminder that the games we love don't just appear out of thin air. They're made by people. Brilliant, flawed, overworked, passionate people. And the studios that make them are living, breathing entities that can achieve greatness and face profound failure. What studio should we explore next on the Game Codex? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring those digital worlds. And remember, be kind to each other, and maybe don't pre-order that collector's edition until you see the reviews. I'm Alora, and this has been the Game Codex. Thanks for watching.